Okay.
Yes, extreme.
Sure thing. Okay, you can remove then the flyer. Okay. Good afternoon, good morning. Welcome back to the Gerhard Center webinar series. We actually put it on hold for almost a year, and it's always a pleasure to come back, and especially with two distinguished speakers. Now, everybody now keeps asking about what's going on from a geopolitical trade war, issues are happening. The topic of this webinar is about the sustainability ESG. Yes, granted, we've been seeing polarization, shift to the right, and this has been happening for a while. People are asking questions. Are companies really walking the talk? Or are they, many companies we see are running away from previous commitments. The title of the webinar is I think it's very indicative. Will sustainability follows ESG into recession? So the assumption is that ESG is in recession. Now the question is, will sustainability at large follows or not? Does it matter? And I would love to get our distinguished speakers, what can we do about it? Let me introduce you the speakers first. Now, John Ilkington is referred to as the godfather of sustainability. The godfather of sustainability and the ambassadors from the future. Most of us would know him through the concept of a triple bottom line. He came up with the concept. It's interesting because it was introduced in an article called Cannibals with Forks and Knives. Now, I'll leave it at this. One of his recent publications, he introduced the Green Swan, which is also one of our webinar series, and he talks about innovations and the role of innovation in creating exponential growth. His latest book is Tickling Shocks. John is on the board of the Gerhard Center, and I really appreciate his help and support in getting us with contacts, connections, ideas, etc. One of the real valuable contacts that John introduced us to us is Jed Emerson. Jed came with the concept of blended value, and many of the people who are really into sustainability would tell you that this is a precursor of the concept of shared value, which is Porter's later after that. He's one of the first authors on impact investment. One of his very interesting books, and I have to warn you, this is not for the faint-hearted. You really have to sort of, it's called The Purpose of Capital, Elements of Impact, Financial Flows, and Natural Being. Now, without much ado, again, we need to talk about ESG. Assumption is, it is in recession. Is sustainability gonna follow? Does it matter? And I also would be very interested to know, what can we do? Now, the rules of the game, again, here, like before, if you have a question, just give us the first 15, 20 minutes. So we introduce some of the ideas, the concepts, and then raise your hand. And we would try to make it as interactive as possible. So if you raise your hand, we will let you unmute, turn on your video, and you can ask your questions and discuss it with the two gentlemen. Okay, without much ado, John, Jed, floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Ali. Let me just say a couple of things just to begin. Well, hello everyone on the webinar, and I'm amazed to see we're already up to 65 people, and I understand there's some younger students among you, which is very exciting indeed, because these are exciting times. And I'm going to hand over to Jed in just a second, but I just want to make a couple of quick introductory points. Firstly, Ali, thank you for organizing the webinar. Thanks for what the center does. I think that we are going to have to, right at the beginning of this conversation, distinguish between ESG, environmental, social, and governance investment, and impact investment, and sustainability, and some of these different concepts. There are many people out there who just treat them all as the same. thing. And I think if you hear somebody saying that, it just shows that they don't really understand the field and the agenda at all. I think ESG is in recession. And part of the reason for that is there's been something of a feeding frenzy where sort of everyone suddenly wanted to set up an ESG fund. Already, there had been considerable concern over the last 18 months to 2 years about the quality of the analysis that was being done on those funds. So already you had some cleaning up going on. But then, as Jed, I'm sure we'll get into in the US in particular, we've had the ESG backlash. That leads to the question of whether everything else will go down the same sort of plug hole. Um, I don't think so, although I think sustainability will, as an agenda, be very much on the back foot for a period of time. And just towards a conclusion, I just want to say brands are in retreat on ESG, but also on climate, on diversity, equity, and inclusion, on a range of these different linked themes, and not just in the US. For example, in the European Union, I've worked with a number of companies over the last sort of 5 or 6 months who are going through a period or a process of trying to work out how they dilute, how they step back from some of the very public commitments they've made. So, for example, late last year, I was in Stuttgart in Germany with Mercedes-Benz a few days after their CEO had announced that that company, an automotive company, would not reach its 2030 targets of 100% electric vehicles by 2030. Now, at some level, you can understand this because, in a way, the charging or the recharging infrastructure has not come in as fast as it might have done. The internal combustion engine industry has tried to sow confusion by saying these things don't have very much range and all sorts of other things. But I actually think it's clinically stupid when competitive companies surrender their market, in this case, the Chinese, because you now have BYD saying that they can recharge electric vehicles in 5 minutes. And so they're simply, and the prices and the quality, just they will wipe the floor with some of their European competitors. So you're seeing two things, and I'll then turn to Jed, but there are two things at the same time. You're seeing people stepping back from some of the poorly understood, poorly framed, and not particularly well-intentioned commitments they made. But at the same time, you see the competitive pressures building in one industry after another. Jed, I mean, you're currently in Norway, which is why you look so wonderfully elegant and sporty. It does strike me that we both, in the marketing materials for this webinar, we were both wearing jackets and looking rather grown up and business friendly, but here we are looking informal. So you're in Norway, but you've just come in from the States. How do you read what's going on there? And what do you see the implications, particularly for impact investment, but for the wider field as well?
Sure. Well, I guess, well, first off, I apologize if I'm a little scruffy for tonight's conversation. So I
That's
hope,
not what I was saying.
and then I do want to say Ali was good enough to reference my last book, which is The Purpose of Capital. And we're not just shilling the book. You can go to purposeofcapital.org and get free copies of the ebook that you can download. And again, it's kind of a thicker reflection on the history, philosophy, spiritualism, actually, relative to many of the topics that we're going to be touching on tonight. And so it is a slightly thicker read. But having said that, there's also a music video that only takes about 4 minutes to listen to. So if you don't have time for the book, the music video might be an option for you. I say all that because I think it's important that we view the current moment in the context of where we have been. And where does this all kind of evolve out of? And I think the danger for all of us, but certainly for those of us who are trying to advance the work and the practice and the vision with regard to sustainability and other concepts like blended value, is that every generation thinks that they are the pinnacle of human development. And the irony, as Arnold Toynbee, the historian, said, is that on the one hand, they are the pinnacle of development. And on the other hand, every generation is the pinnacle of development. And so we need to be careful not to think that we're the first ones to grapple with these issues and these challenges that we're dealing with today for today's generation. And I say that I'll pick up first on John's comment about kind of like the different terms and concepts and kind of how we got here. And then I'll land in terms of my perspective with regard to where we are today. But I think it's important that we understand that these issues have been a part of the conversation regarding capitalism and economics since the beginning of capitalism. The first publicly traded company, the Dutch East India Group, a significant number of investors were Mennonite, and they sold their shares to protest the business practices of the Dutch East India Group because they involved warfare instead of trade. And they said that it was a violation of fiduciary duty. And so at the very beginning, like 400 years ago, you have investors raising questions and challenges about how companies were being run and operated. If you fast forward to the 60s, you again had different religious groups who said they didn't want to manage their capital on terms that were in conflict with their values and their beliefs and their vision about what it was that the world should be about and how they wanted their wealth and their money to show up in that world. And so you saw investors screening portfolios and screening out, quote, bad companies. And so that was really the first phase of a lot of this work in the current kind of modern context. And then in the 70s, with the creation of, in the United States, the Environmental Protection Agency, and in Europe, kind of similar agencies, you really had, for the first time, companies were being asked to report out on not just financial performance, but environmental performance and levels of pollution. And people began to say, well, if you can screen out bad companies, can you screen in good companies? And that evolved into the ESG kind of discipline and practice, and kind of saying these factors of environmental, social, and governance performance of companies will affect and are material to financial performance and return. And so in the 90s, you had a new set of asset owners who came into the space. They were already screening their portfolios, both in a positive and negative tilt kind of fashion. But these folks said, I want to draw as straight a line as possible between the investment of my capital and the generation of kind of net positive impact in the world. And these were folks who came out of venture and private equity investing practices. Their wealth, their companies really were created by virtue of that type of investing, as opposed to investing in public markets with publicly listed companies. And these were folks who then said, I want to have the greatest impact possible. And so what I think we see then in the last 10 years was each of these approaches, and I would include sustainable finance, blended finance, catalytic capital. I mean, all of these different terms were really almost block parties, if you will, with different practitioners and advocates and enthusiasts really saying, here's the answer, this is what we should do. And over the last 15 years, we saw really an influx of people attracted to each of these different ways to think about how do we approach not only the investment of capital, but the management of companies. And what happened was you ended up with so many people on the block, they kind of poured out onto the avenues. And you could, for the first time, really look up and down the avenue, and you could see each individual parade. You could see the sustainability folks, you could see the blended finance, the impact, the broader screen portfolio folks. And we understood really for the first time that this is all part of a broad kind of set of practices and initiatives that has different nuance and effect, but it's all focused on how do we do things that are more than just oriented toward economic and financial analysis and investing in practice. And, I kind of came to this in the late 90s. I had been running a fund that was investing in small businesses that were owned by nonprofits, providing transitional employment to formerly homeless folks. And after about 11 years of running that fund, I realized that I'd become agnostic about the type of investment vehicle, the type of organizational form, and really had gone to this place of saying that, look, the only thing that matters is an understanding of the nature of the value that you want to create. And once you have clarity around that for a given point in time, then you can begin to say, well, what's the best corporate structure? What are the best metrics? What are the best structures of capital that we can then deploy in pursuit of that value? And so a lot of this, I think, was building and building. And then you had the mainstream actors, the large financial institutions, the large companies who really began to say, look, our customers are asking for this, our employees are asking for this. And so, we need to get on board. We need to be a part of this. And so it really went mainstream, to my mind, kind of in a blink of an eye, because, John and I and others are part of a generation of folks who really have spent the last 30 or 40 years kind of working and promoting these ideas and collaborating with people around the world to bring this practice forward. And it really was only been in the last 10 years that this really was picked up and run by large companies, by large financial institutions. And so that practice, as it went mainstream, let's say 5 to 10 years ago, began to attract a lot of attention. A lot of folks from more traditional frameworks of the only thing that matters is shareholder value and return. The only thing that matters is the financial performance, and all of these other things are nice to have, but not necessary. A lot of those folks still picked up the practice. And so in the US, when you had the rise of the right, in our context, you then had a whole set of people who politicized what this is, polarized the conversation, and that then became the ESG backlash that John referred to earlier. That I think, in some ways, really, I think I don't know, John, tell me what you think, but I think it's fair to say that a lot of the backlash began in the United States as part of the polarization that was happening politically. And now it is evolving more around Europe and other areas. And so I think that on the one hand, it is shifting, it's changing, we're being challenged in new and different ways. On the other hand, it is simply the same journey, the same path, the same set of deliberations and discussions that we've had for centuries. So I'll stop there.
No, that's been a masterclass in the history, the emergence, the evolution of all of this, Jed. Thank you. I don't think the US is alone in all of this. So, for example, in Europe, you've had pushback against things like heat pumps in Germany, where the government has been trying to promote heat pumps for energy efficiency purposes, but people who are having to swap out their boilers for heat pumps are getting quite agitated. So there's been quite a lot of political pushback there. In France, you've had pushback, particularly from the farmers, which is always very notable because they park their tractors in the main streets of Paris and places like that, the Champs-Élysées. And that's been around all sorts of things, climate-related controls, chemical controls on agriculture, and so on. So this is boiling up in different places, but I think it is very much encouraged by what the Trump administration has been doing. You mentioned the Environmental Protection Agency, stuffing that agency with people who basically are chemical industry stooges. I mean, people who are champions of bad practice. So, but in just a couple of quick observations. I remember the first time I ever went to the United States professionally, which was 1981. I was up in the Rockies, which is a part of the world that you know very well, Jed. And I was visiting a molybdenum mine, a sort of metals mine. And a vice president took me out around the mine after the lunch, and he said, the one thing to remember about American politics is that American politics is a bit like a grandfather clock, a very big wooden clock. Sort of often they used to be made by coffin makers, so very same shape and so on. And he said, within the clock, you have a pendulum which swings back and forth. And he said, sometimes the pendulum goes so far one way that when it comes back, it smashes through the wall of the clock. And I think that's exactly where we are now. And this isn't unique in American history. In fact, there is a recurrent pattern of this. What's different this time is America's role in the global economy is much more integrated, energetic, and so on. So for at least for a period of time, I think Trump can get away with rattling the bars on everyone's cages. But just to come back to you, Jed, I think two things again. One is, I think all of this is going to go a lot deeper. It's going to get a lot worse before it has any chance of turning a corner. That said, I'm actually more optimistic about our agenda, the agenda which you so sort of nicely characterized in its evolution, I'm more optimistic because firstly, I think it needed a shock. It needed to sort of step back and rethink. It needed to, you talked about these crowds of different agenda-linked people, different agendas spilling out into the streets of New York or whatever. Well, they need to work out how to increasingly work together rather than being this sort of very fractured political landscape. They have to become political. They have to understand how to do the politics of all of this. And so I think in the next 3 to 5 years, and it's got to be done actually, the initial part of this much faster, because within 12 to 18 months, I think Trump's support will actually see everything going to pieces. And they'll ask, well, if not that, then what? And we've got to have a workable alternative in place by then. But I suppose the question to you is, do you think there was an inevitability of this? I mean, you've obviously signaled that there is an ESG recession. Is that spilling over into the impact space? How long, if that is the case, do you think that's going to last? Is it going to do lasting damage? Is it healthy? Where's your thinking on all of that?
I guess I don't want to let the language get in the way of the practice. And
Yeah.
so I think our focus needs to be we should only use language in these terms to the degree that they help inform and educate us about what it is we're trying to do. And so before impact investing came out as a term, which was around 2007, there were a host of us, yourself included, who were exploring, advancing, and engaging in different parts of this, whether it was community economic development, international development finance, I mean, all kinds of things that are all part of this, again, this kind of parade that we have. And when I remember when impact investing was first brought out, I actually was kind of miffed because I felt like, great, so here's one more term that I'm going to have to spend my time and energy explaining to people and trying to help folks understand, well, how does that differ from socially responsible investing or screened funds or, just go right down the list of terms. But I think, I don't know if this is true or not, but Chairman Mao was supposed to have said that a leader is somebody who sees a parade and runs to stand in front of it. And so
that was Napoleon.
it was Napoleon.
Mao may well have picked up on it, but that was Napoleon. I see where my men are going, and then I race to get ahead of them.
So that's great. So I'll have to add that. I think, but I think the point is when that came out, I had a choice personally around kind of like, all right, well, do you fight this new term? Because it clearly was getting traction. The Rockefeller Foundation was putting $40 million into convening and promoting this idea, this new quote unquote kind of way to think about it. And so I ended up connecting with the guy who ran the Rockefeller Initiative, and we co-authored then the first book on impact investing. And so I tried to take a lot of the concepts and ideas that I felt the field and myself had been promoting as part of this generation, and weave it into like the current thinking and practice. And so I think that when we talk about, is this going away? Is it under challenge? Do we need to reinvent it? Yes, on all those counts, in the same way that we had to reinvent and challenge the thinking that we were operating within 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago. The one difference today is, I think, well, there's a number of differences, but one of them is that we used to say that we would be successful when all of these conversations simply were a form of good investment practice and good company management. And so that's all this is about, is kind of, what makes for the most effective approach to managing capital and managing companies. And so what I think is really interesting is if you take away the buzz and the arguments around ESG and DEI and these other things, a lot of the traditional investing houses are using what I would view as ESG and impact frameworks to inform their investing strategies. They're just not calling it impact and ESG because to them, of course, you want to have more and better data to inform your investing strategy and practice. Of course, you want to open the aperture and get more analysis into informing how you deploy capital, how you run companies. Of course, people recognize that there's there is financial elements, but there are extra financial elements, things that don't show up in traditional accounting and financial approach. And John, you really led the practice around a lot of this work in terms of how do you frame this analytic approach in a way that is both financial but also integrated with extra financial elements that you're considering. And so I think what is interesting to watch is two things. One is today, in the last, let's say, 24 months, there's been a real orientation around systems investing. How do you invest with a system frame? How do you understand the part of which you are a whole, if you will, and how what you do fits in within this larger kind of piece? And so that, I think, is very interesting. And because it's not an answer, it's a set of better questions. And it's an approach that says this is all whole, it's all integrated, it's all connected, it's all one. And with that mindset, how are you part of what that is, right? And asking people to be clear around that. That's one part. The other part is when you talk with people who are fundamental investors, they are saying, look, I mean, why would you not do this? This is just good investing practice. We're not going to call it ESG or impact, because if in Europe, if you call it that, then you're open to a whole bunch of new reporting criteria that you have to adhere to. And in the US, if you call it that, you're going to get under attack by the far right. So I think that this is part of the opportunity that we have, is to really rise above the language, look at the practice, and lift that up for new applications as we go forward in these times.
Yeah, I love that way of framing it, Jed. Just one of the things, the way I try and explain to people who are in business leadership roles is that I ask them whether they remember total quality management, because there was a period when everyone was racing around the landscape thinking about quality, and we have to have board level roles on all of that stuff. And now it's just integrated into what companies do if they're going to survive. Then we had information technology, IT. And everyone was sort of thinking about this has got to go up to the board level and all the rest of it. And now it's largely integrated into what companies do. And I think the same will be to some considerable extent to the sorts of things that we're talking about here. But we're talking here in the context of a university, the American University in Cairo. And when I think about the last 30 some years, I think in many ways, and there have been some wonderful, exceptional faculty members in business schools and universities, there have been some wonderful centers. But overall, I think the university sector has betrayed a series of generations of young people by not properly educating them in the sorts of things that we're now discussing. Now, you've taught, as I've taught, at all sorts of universities and business schools. Do you think that's accurate? Do you see a more hopeful picture? What sort of trends do you see in that educational space?
Honestly, I think I see a more hopeful approach. And
Yeah.
so when I first started promoting concepts of social entrepreneurship in the 90s, I couldn't get an invitation to speak at a business school. I was in the Bay Area. We tried to promote this stuff. And it was viewed as a career killer for academics to look at this work, because it was viewed as not grounded in good academic thought and practice and what have you. And I think what happened, or I don't think, my experience of what happened was that it was really the student body that applied pressure to the administration, to the faculty, and said, we don't want to study Milton Friedman. We want to study John Elkington. We want to look at, what are the current kind of exciting ways that we can get out of some of the traps that traditional capitalism has brought us toward. And so I think that to my experience, I mean, I don't think I would have had teaching appointments at the different graduate schools of business that I've been affiliated with over the years, were it not for the fact that the mainstream faculty didn't want to teach this. And so they would bring me in as an adjunct to teach it. And now I can't get a job at a traditional academic institution because you can get a PhD in sustainability. You can get a master's in impact investing. It has gone kind of totally mainstream in terms of that practice and that work. It is still a smaller subset of the broader kind of economic and behavioral economic and other disciplines, but it is totally there and viable. And so I think this is really something that will continue to have to be driven by the generations that are coming up, who really are the rising gen that can see forward, around, the barriers that are being presented to them, by their elders, and are in fact looking for the second and third horizon, not the first horizon that's right in front of us.
Well, in a moment, let's hand back to Ali just to see whether we're getting interesting questions or comments. But just a quick observation on that, Jed. About 3 weeks ago, I was asked to help kick off a new center at Imperial College, now simply called, and I don't think it's very good branding, but Imperial in London. And I've taught there for over 30 years. But they said, look, we're gonna do something revolutionary. We're going to set up a school of sustainability. And I have to say, my God, I think that's not very clever, because you should have been doing that 20 years ago or whatever. They said, no, what we're going to do, we're going to set up a school of convergent science. And within that, we're going to focus on health and on security and on sustainability, four different areas, and pull together all of the resources of the universities. And I thought, that's really interesting, because that's the beginning of the necessary restructuring in the university system, which I now think needs to sort of rattle through.
Yeah. Well, before we turn it over to Ali, where you stand depends on where you sit.
Yeah.
And I think what we forget, I think the older you get, the more you see how at different stages of your own development, you had an answer that you thought was a really good answer. And as you work that answer over 5, 10, 15 years, you realize that, oh, wait, that's not really the answer. This other thing over here is really and I think that what we need to rediscover is the fact and the realization that this is really cross-disciplinary. It cuts across different perspectives, worldviews, cultures. The right answer is right for a certain set of stakeholders and actors operating within a certain context and environment. And that answer will itself evolve and change and grow. And so this is why not only this kind of discussion, but the institution of the American school there in Cairo, facilitating, bringing this forward, convening these kind of conversations between practitioners, pseudo thought leaders, such as ourselves. I mean, I think that's really the great opportunity. So I'm really pleased to be here. And Ali, I'll turn it over to you with that said.
Okay, just a comment. Usually when you have a change, I mean, even if it's disruptive change, it's an outlier. It starts as an outlier.
Yeah.
And it takes a while until it gets to a mainstream. And here also, I mean, academia especially, they are very conservative. I could tell you many examples. One of the interesting ones I heard from Stu Hart, who with C.K. Praland came up with the concept of base of the pyramid. At that time, they used to call it bottom of the pyramid. They had an article, and he swears none of the academic journals wanted to publish it. So they had to publish it in Business and Strategy, and it ended up being the most referred piece of work on base of the pyramid. So universities typically are very conservative. There is also like a mainstream, and they resist. But interesting, I mean, once you have an idea coming from an outlier, the way they jump at it, they do it like a stampede kind of a thing. And most of them don't have a clue what it means, but they still would do. You still would because it became fashion, became vogue.
Yeah.
Universities are not a good example of leading a change. I mean,
but just that pattern of innovation coming from the edges of a system, I think happens time and again. And Jed mentioned earlier on these waves and cycles of societal pressure on governments, on business, on the financial markets, and so on. And when I look back at my working life, I mean, initially what I was trying to do is bring NGOs, activists, campaigners into the world of business, and then a bunch of other people, and then the social entrepreneurs that Jed was referencing, and then it was clean tech entrepreneurs. And now it's, when you look for where the edge of tomorrow's system is, you're no longer necessarily looking for small outlier, troublesome, hard to frame people. You're possibly looking at, for example, China. And you're looking at a country now that commands increasingly the uh, the critical sectors of tomorrow's economy, whether it's solar, wind, batteries, whether it's rare earth minerals, electric vehicles, artificial intelligence. Think about DeepSeek. You've got this sort of strategic approach to thinking about how do we do tomorrow differently. And so I think we've got to engage the activists, the troublemakers. I love them to pieces. We've got to engage the social innovators, social entrepreneurs, all of those good people. But we've actually also got to look, we've got to open our minds to, and where is the future coming together fastest? And it's not always where Trump would be necessarily comfortable to know that it's coming together fastest.
Yeah, but unfortunately for us in the Middle East, or maybe even in Africa, we tend to think in terms of innovation, technologies, latest innovation coming either from North America or Europe.
Yeah.
We rarely think in terms of China or India, or maybe even Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. There are lots of innovations in terms of frugal innovation, social innovation that is coming from Africa, but we don't look at it with the same kind of a weight.
Well, I think one of the things that Trump may unconsciously be engineering is a world in which the global south starts to come together in very different constellations with European member states and all sorts of different things to drive innovation in different directions and access thinking. I mean, I mentioned China, you mentioned India. Whether it's India or Indonesia or Brazil or whatever, innovation is happening in these places. We've got to be out there understanding what people are trying to do, supporting them and helping them, scale what they do.
Yeah. The other, I think, bias that is there, and it could be colonialism kind of a thing, is we tend to think about innovation that is technology driven. It has to be technology driven, or it has to be latest technology. Sometimes innovation is how you use technology that could be existed for a long time. And business schools do not promote this, do not promote frugal innovation, do not promote innovation for the poor. Do not promote practicality and how do you go about innovation. It's really about the latest technology, about the latest deep tech that's gonna sort of result in a unicorn that's gonna come. But we never think of a little technologies that might come from grassroots and they aggregate and then that kind of a thing. So there is a bias. And I think business schools play a major role in it. Major role in it.
Yeah. Well, I think
but anyway.
Yeah, partly what you're describing as a problem is a function of the fact that the very big tech companies put a lot of money into business schools and universities. And so of course, they're going to focus on the latest shiny object and what might be done with it. But I think frugal innovation, I mean, it's been much talked about for quite a long time. But as you say, the critical mass has not yet properly developed. And I think there's a huge opportunity space there. But do we have questions or comments from people?
I don't see any. Well, guys, I mean, if you have a question, just feel free, raise your hand.
Well,
okay, there is one there.
Yeah.
Okay, can you hold on a second? I'm trying to identify. Can you unmute the guy who actually?
Salman.
Okay, I'm trying to find.
Oh, there we go. Ahmed is off mute.
Great.
Yes, I'm unmuted.
Okay, would you please unmute and show your video and then ask your questions, please?
Yes, I'm sorry, Dr. Ali, I will not be able to show my video right now. However, I would like to start to thank you, Dr. Ali, and thank you, John and Jad for this. I actually found your book, Jad, at blended something.org, blendedvalue.org. and I'm actually looking forward to reading them. I'm teaching entrepreneurship and sustainability here at the American University in Cairo, and that's why I'm very interested in your discussion. First thing, I want to note something that Dr. Ali said, who, by the way, was my professor one day. Dr. Ali, you taught me about frugal innovation. Maybe the school was not really interested in that, but the professor, him or herself, will actually take the initiative to talk about the issue that they might find that is interesting, and the students must know about it. And you are actually the first one that taught me about frugal innovation. So maybe the school will not take action, but as a professor, we should have take action some way. And that this will lead me to the question for both of you, John and Jan. And yes, you are talking about that sustainability will be declining. What should I do? What can I do in the courses that I teach? I teach both undergraduates and graduate students here at AUC.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great question. Jed, do you want to kick off? And
Well, I guess the key thing to my mind is the framing and this idea that the answers evolve and change with regard to the context. And again, I will do another quote that John may know the actual origins of. And that Albert Einstein is said to have said, and then I've also read that he never said this, but he is said to have said, if he was given a question and 1 hour to solve it, and his life depended on solving this question, that he would take 55 minutes to consider the question, and then it would only take 5 minutes to get the answer. And part of the challenge around, quote, innovation and all these other things, certainly in the United States, and I think this is true in some other areas I've seen as well, is that people lead with their answers. And you end up in a situation where you're opposition to each other, and you're trying to always convince the other person, whether it's an investor or a colleague or whomever, you're trying to convince them of the righteousness of your answer as opposed to their answer or response. And I think what we really need to be encouraging students and practitioners to do is to get on the same side of the table and look forward together and co-create responses, not answers, but responses to the challenges of today that neither of us might have seen if we were just in this oppositional posture. And so I think helping people understand, how do you show up in the context of the inquiry? How do you show up in a way as a professor teaching concepts and ideas and the practices, so that it's not answer, but a process of inquiry and reflection that can bring you to deeper, better, more effective potential solutions going forward. I think that's the opportunity that it sounds like you may have in your role. John?
Well, I'd absolutely support and underscore what Jed just said. And I think one of the problems in recent years has been there's been a trend in some universities to discourage active disagreement among people. And I think, it's very easy to say I support freedom of speech, but I think helping students, and I don't just mean younger people, I mean anyone with an open mind wanting to learn, and that could be people of any age, to be comfortable or more comfortable than they otherwise would be with disagreement. And sometimes with disagreeable people that they don't particularly like. And one of the things I've noticed recently is the number of people in my space have been just sitting down and listening to podcasts and other content put out by some of the people who've been championing some of the different points of view that we like to hate. And I think a certain amount of that is necessary. But if we'd done that during the Nazi period and occupied Europe, it wouldn't have been wonderfully helpful. I mean, it would have helped us develop strategies and so on. So first thing, pay attention to what's really going on in the wider world. Try and understand and engage with some of the people who are driving things in a direction that we may not be comfortable with, and see where the points of overlap might be in terms of the sorts of outcomes that we would want to see in the world. The second point is that I think for the next couple of years, there's going to be a very great tendency for people to think about the end of the world, that everything is coming apart, because an old order that evolved after the Second World War United Nations, the World Bank, all of these different institutions, they're under challenge in a way that they haven't been previously. And they're not necessarily, all of them, going to survive. And you have this very different macroeconomic picture, you have this very different geopolitical picture. So things are going to be disturbed, disrupted, turbulent, chaotic for quite some period of time. And I'd like, I mean, we've been quoting Mao, we've been quoting Napoleon, we've been quoting Einstein. I think one of the things we've all got to be able to do is stand back to some degree from what we are experiencing going on in our world and be able to see to some degree the underlying trends, trajectories, patterns, and all of this, and help, particularly in this case, younger people understand that this is not the end of the world. This is a period that the world's economies and societies go through uh, every so often. You could have said historically it was every 60 to 80 years. It's now concentrating a bit. And the odd thing is, just to finalize this, I've been saying recently, I feel more energized and I feel more, in a weird way, optimistic about our agenda, change agenda, than I have done for about 10 to 15 years. And the reason is once that things are in flux, if you know what you're doing and you're consistent and coherent and you have stamina and you build critical mass for change, things can go much further than you might otherwise expect. So I think this is it's a profoundly exciting time, even though it's quite distressing
Yeah.
day by day.
Well, and it speaks to the whole notion of crisis as opportunity. And I think that today, right now, on the back of the last, 72 hours or so, I'm kind of freaked out about what's happening to global capital markets. Having said that, it will create an opportunity to move from a Pax Americana and a kind of a American dominance to a multipolar kind of power and economic and innovation opportunity where other regions of the world will be able to leverage and advance and innovate in a way that was not really possible when the United States was so dominant a force culturally and intellectually and in a whole host of ways. And so I hope that we can make this shift with as little damage to humanity as possible and as little damage to the earth and to ecosystems as possible. But really, this is what happens. In Buddhist terms, there's the notion of reverse movement because everything is one, everything is connected. So if you're pushing here, something else will pop out there. And so this is part of the process, if you will, of what's known as being and becoming, where on the one hand, we have that clarity of how we show up today, but we're also leaning forward to what we're called to become as we go forward in the coming decades. And I think that's the thing. And we just have to really work not to destroy the earth or other human beings in that process of transition, which can be very, very disruptive and painful in very negative ways, as we're already seeing.
Yeah. I have a question probably from Salma El-Deep. So I'm going to ask her to unmute.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to ask her also if she can show her video so we can see her. Salma, please ask your question here.
Okay, my video is disabled by the host. It says disabled by host.
Okay, can you enable her video, please? In the
Shazam.
meantime, just ask your
Yeah,
question.
Shazam. I would say right now what's going on, I'm seeing there's ongoing trade wars, which is going to likely cause an increase in the cost of resources and limit the availability of substitutes.
Yeah.
And like Trump wants to drive the US economic growth and increase local businesses, but until these businesses can be realized in the US, it will take years, and its urgency could actually allow companies to get away with not being green so as to exist and form. So this would likely push back sustainability. Also, you have the threat of decreasing the trade of earth minerals, which we're seeing as a response from China. And this, the earth minerals are used for renewable energy. So this also is going to likely decrease sustainable development and ESG implementation. So I'm kind of assuming that despite the Paris Agreement and everything that's going on, we're likely going to see a decrease in all of that and a lot of companies falling back on their promises, which will also likely increase greenwashing.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think the question is how long this will go on for and how long people are allowed to get away with, for example, greenwashing or ESG washing or blue washing by association with the United Nations or whatever it might be. And I think there is a huge challenge for civil society and activist groups and for committed companies to monitor what's going on, to be able to measure the direction of change and share the information back and forth. Because one of the things that really worries me at the moment is that I've spent 40 years plus trying to get companies to be more transparent, to be more accountable, to produce annual or quarterly reports on sustainability related issues, the sorts of things that you were talking about, their role in the green economy, their supply chains on rare earth minerals or whatever it might be. But what you're getting now is some really rather bureaucratic approaches where tens of thousands of companies are being encouraged to produce these annual reports, and increasingly are starting to use AI to do that, which is interesting, but also slightly concerning. But when that's the supply side. So we're getting lots of data being produced, but the demand side, the use phase of all of this is not properly yet addressed. And I think AI could play quite an important role there. So I think what you've just described, Sama, is exactly right. We're going to go through a period of quite some turbulence, but the prospect of getting a better system or set of system conditions the other side of that is higher than it ever has been. And I think collectively we've got to work out how do we make this work, and how do we collaborate in some very different ways to make all of this work. Jed, what's your thinking?
Well, I mean, I would just say yes, I agree, and this is how it happens. This is what's in some ways. Warren Buffett talks about how when the tide goes out, you see who's swimming without bathing suit, right? I think it's. I don't want to say it's great. I think it's good because it's forcing people to be more clear, to be more accountable. You can see in the finance, I've done spent a lot of my time in finance and in capital markets. You see how quickly the large financial institutions have turned their back on a lot of these practices, and the claims and the commitments and the pledges. They're they're just all of a sudden running away within months of commitments that they've made over the past few years, simply in response to marketing and the greenwashing that you're describing. I think that's a good thing. I think it shows really where they stand, if you will. And it's also a way for others of us to differentiate and to be able to say, here's the better practice. And we need to advance practice that informs the work we're doing, not simply adheres to a set of doctrines or dogma or what have you, but really is embedded in the work. And I think we're seeing, going back to the innovation piece, a lot of innovation and entrepreneurship taking place, because the one thing we have got to remember is none of this washes away the reality of the climate crisis. None of this washes away the reality of hyper concentration of wealth among the very, very elite of various societies across the world. And these will have to be addressed. And I think that this is part of the reason why I try not to get too kind of caught up in the language terms, because I think we are out of balance, and this is all part of a process of kind of right sizing, if you will. And it will come. It has to come, because fundamentally it is all one. It's all whole. We can't think about economics in the absence of thinking about social and environmental aspects of value creation. And so this will be brought forward. And so this is why I'm so excited to see the demand and the interest of the rising generation of investors, of fiduciaries, of entrepreneurs, of policymakers and visionaries, because that really is where we're headed. aside, you can't stop this train. This is where it is going. And so it may take a little longer. We may have some detours. There are going to be continuing challenges. But the fact that we're having this discussion at the level of global kind of dialogue among various communities, among various stakeholder groups around the world is something that 40 years ago, we were saying, gosh, wouldn't it be great if? Well, guess what? Like it's happening today and we're all a part of that.
And speaking of dialogue, Ali, I can see at least two other hands.
I think some people would raise their hand and then they will disappear. But there is Dr. Muhga Batran, and I'm going to ask her to unmute and ask her question. If you don't mind, guys, we can spill over for another 10 minutes after the.
I can certainly do that.
Yeah, that would be fine.
After the 8 o'clock. Okay. Dr. Muhga, please unmute yourself.
Okay. Yes, I'm just wanted to say that in the universities, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, that in universities, we are really giving knowledge and students to prepare them for work and to be future leaders. But the way we're doing it now is that we are giving them, knowledge that could be used yesterday or maybe tomorrow, but not for the future. So what kind of knowledge or topics need to be introduced, and what are the skills and competencies that are required for the type of world that they would live in, or what the issues that you were talking about? And again here, if we are going to give them those competencies, how can we possibly teach it? Because I mean, in universities now, we are really very siloed. Okay, some of us may take a topic that cuts across some, but at least we are still giving them knowledge that is now. Yeah. And what kind of knowledge or topics need to be introduced in universities? What teaching methodologies and what competencies do those young leaders, potential leaders in the future? They may not have the time that we have, for example, to experiment.
Yeah. Well, it's a great question. And
if you have,
I think at least my answer would in part be, and I'd be fascinated to hear what Jet has to say about this, but I think one of the things that the COVID pandemic did to all of us was to force us into our homes and into a more closed environment and online. And I think whether these are students we're talking about, whether it's faculty members and teachers, whether it's people who work in companies, people who work in government, we've all got to get out more, and we've got to go and visit people who are innovating and doing new things or doing old things in new ways. And when Jed talked about the social entrepreneurs in different parts of the world, one of the great joys of my life has been visiting some of these people and visiting some of the extraordinary businesses in different parts of the world, coming up with solutions. And although that doesn't necessarily fit into an academic environment that readily, I think companies are beginning to work on this. Question is, can universities follow suit? Because I think if people do see with their own eyes the future already in existence, it's massively motivating, and it really inspires them to stay the course. Jed, what's your thinking on this?
I was at a summit in Singapore, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 months ago. And one of the panels that was very provocative was had a number of people, but there were these two guys who were presented as kind of physics folks. They came out of the hard sciences, had been very innovative and created some phenomenal kind of strategies that then they commercialized, and they became very wealthy. So they then became venture capitalists and are now like some of the leading AI investors. And so the whole panel was about how should family offices invest in AI and what are the implications of AI for strategy for people that some of the families that I would work with. And first off, what was interesting was they said, don't invest in AI because by the time you see it, we have already passed on the opportunity. And the only reason they're coming to you is that we didn't invest. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But setting that aside, when they came back off the panel, I said to them, we were sitting there and we were talking about the implications of all this. And I said, so I guess we all shouldn't learn how to code anymore, right? Because for a number of years, people were saying, if you really want to get ahead, you need to learn how to code. You got to be on top of this. And now with AI, you don't have to learn how to code. You can just like put it out there and the AI kind of does it. And I said, so what should we be teaching people coming up through the ranks? And I was quite frankly a little taken aback because they said liberal arts, that what we're missing is, they said, people like us, like we're trained in a very kind of skills-based way, but we often aren't trained in terms of how do you think? How do you connect the dots across disciplines, across cultures, across markets? And I was really, I was taken with that. It wasn't, the thing that I thought was kind of interesting was that I've heard that consistently over the years from business people, is that they can train people to build an Excel spreadsheet. They can train people to do different kind of exercises, and they need people who come to the game with a certain set of skills, yes. But ultimately, they need people who know how to think, who can think out of the box, can think strategically, and be more kind of, again, kind of in the present, but living in the future kind of thing. And that's hard to teach. That's a very hard challenge, but ultimately that's what we need, are leaders, managers, entrepreneurs, innovators who can, on the one hand, connect kind of where we are today with what's coming, but on the other hand, not be trapped by what is today.
So just let's take another question, but just
Yeah.
to put a spin on what Jed just said, I think curiosity, you can't teach people, but you can encourage it. But secondly, the capacity to continuously learn, to never believe you're a total expert on anything. If you can get people to that point of whatever age, I think that's really helpful. Back to you, Ali.
Okay. There is 3 questions. There is one from Farah. I'm going to ask her, and then I'm going to ask Ashwan. So let's start by Farah. Please unmute and ask your question, ya Farah.
Hi. So I have had a certain concern since I started university, which is that within our community, I feel that there is lack of awareness generally, and especially when we take our core business subjects, we're constantly asked to create business ideas and get creative, especially while taking into account the ESGs. And I feel that within a lot of our courses, the information that we're getting about the ESGs is very repetitive. And because there's this lack of awareness on what's going on within our communities, we hear different things from different professors. And then we go outside into the real world, and then we ask like your everyday Egyptians about stats like, I don't know, that have to do with poverty, for example. And they'll say, oh, that doesn't really exist. Maybe it's because we're in denial. I'm not entirely sure what's going on exactly. But it makes things a lot more difficult, especially with these kinds of assignments and long term with our jobs in the future, because it feels like we don't know who to get our facts from. So we don't exactly understand how valid these facts are, especially when they don't tell you when you're going into university that you're going to hear different things from different grown-ups and that not all of these things are going to be correct. So I was wondering if you have any advice on that, and if you have any suggestions for how people like us could actually take initiative instead of just being passive audience members.
I don't get the sense that you're passive. I think that whatever happens, you're going to get out there and do things. A couple of very quick thoughts. I think it's a great question. And I think misinformation and disinformation comes up every year at the World Economic Forum summits. It's something that everyone is concerned about. And younger people have it harder because very often they've not been brought up in a different world where they now see what's coming out from social media and they can sort of judge it with a different sort of point of reference. And somebody described Trump a few days back as post-literate, by which they mean he gets all of his information from social media, and that's incredibly dangerous. And so one of the things I think people have to do, and this is not, Jed was talking about his book. I've done a recent book, Tickling Sharks, which just looks back at the history of the sustainability movement over 50 years or so. I think reading remains enormously important. I think conversations remain critical. I think having conversations with people who are outside your comfort zone. It's easy to say, but finding people who are operating in a somewhat different frame of reference, including some of these people who you go outside and find denial among. It's really important. And you have to have confidence that in 5 or 7 or 10 years, this will settle down in your mind and your lives in a frame that what you hear Jed and I talking about, and Ali, Dr. Ali as well, it sounds as though we know what we're talking about. If you go back 40 years, certainly I wouldn't have been at all coherent. I've known what interested me. So you have to know that that coherence will come to you, and you've got to have that sense of integrity and identity, which sort of carries through you through a lot of this confusion. Again, easy to say, harder to do. Jed, what's your
I think it goes back to the previous question of what should be taught, like how should we be teaching skills? And I think the most important skill is critical thinking, is an approach to information and knowledge that says, what's the source? What's the basis? Does it fit kind of my frame of analyzing information for understanding what is this person's truth as opposed to my truth? Like it is a set of skills that can be taught in terms of, how you get into it. Now, the other thing I would say is that, we need to fall in love with the problems, not the solutions. And so we need to understand that every set of actors, every generation has a way to think about things that will ultimately be wrong because the context, the dynamic, the market, everything will shift and those answers will no longer they won't work, right? And so we have to always be looking forward. And I think that, I often say that when I was in my 30s, I must have been just a total pain in the butt for people in their 60s because and I'm telling you, I knew, you know what I mean? Like I was so passionate and convinced of the righteousness of the ideas that my community was advancing and we were executing and all that stuff. And I looked at people in their 60s saying, you don't understand. You don't, how can you possibly, run the organization the way you're running it? How can you do this? How can you do that? And I think that if my 60-year-old self saw my 30-year-old self, I would have to throw myself out of my office, right? Because I was like so clear. And I think what's been so much fun for me personally over the course of, I'm 66, and over the course of this career is like, I'm really passionate about how I think about things. And I really drive my frames into the ground and they break down and you blow out the back end. And all of a sudden you're sitting in this open space of like, well, so this worked this way. This didn't work that way. What is going to be the next frame, right? And so I'm always trying to think about what's the next frame that's evolving. And I think in some ways it goes back to John's comment about listening to people that you don't talk to normally. And there's a series of podcasts that I've been tracking. I think it's called Matters of Interest or something along those lines. It's in the New York Times kind of podcast group. And they've had interviews with Steve Bannon. They've had interviews with Mark Andreessen. These are two folks who I really do not like. Yeah. And yet sitting there for like an hour, listening to them talk about their process and journey of evolving their ideas and identity, I understand so much more about where they're coming from than before when I would say, well, I don't have any interest in listening to those people because they don't believe anything that I believe. And I want to do this. I don't want to do that. But it helps to kind of like stop and just listen the way John was talking about earlier.
Well, just a quick thing, just for those still in this webinar, just something that you should know is that Jed was in a rock and roll band and has always been full on. He's 66, I'm 75, and I feel I'm just getting started. Back to you, Ali.
Okay, I'm going to take only 3 questions, and then we call it a webinar. So I'm going to start with Ashwani. Please unmute yourself. Go ahead.
That seems working.
Hi, folks. Thank you. Really appreciate this conversation. So I am a professor of sustainability at a liberal undergraduate college in New Jersey. And I want to pick up on the thread that was being talked about earlier, about how do we teach for the future. I agree completely with what you folks are saying. Jed, particularly, we're a liberal arts college, undergraduate only. I chose to do that because I think that's where I can make the most difference, starting off. We talk to the employers a lot. What do you want us to teach our students so they can be more successful in the workforce? Always, they say, don't teach them stuff. The stuff we can teach them in a month. Teach them how to think. Teach them how to read. Teach them how to write, how to present effectively. Be people. That's one thing. So I absolutely agree with that. Second thing I would say to you, the lady that asked about the future, Arthur Sharma, MIT, in his presencing work, makes a very powerful statement. The future cannot happen until you get there. We begin with the wrong model. We can make a plan in advance and lay it out. And that's wrong. It's an evolutionary process. Change happens. We have still not realized the power of Darwin's idea. We can't plan a course into the future and expect to get there by a preconceived path. It is really about making it happen. So adaptive management is one of the things that I push with my students as a way of thinking about projects, right? Let's not think we have a goal, look at the obstacles, the resources, plan a path, go our way. It doesn't work like that. Every time you move, you change the world. And you folks both have said this, Jen, John, that who you are now is fundamentally different from who you were at 30.
Yeah.
And this is true. This is absolutely true. I'm 72. I mean, 2 years back, I didn't think the same way as I think now. So I think for the youngsters, what I would say is don't use the present to project the future. Make the future. Thank you.
Ashwani, thank you very much for that, and thank you for the teaching and the research and so on that you do. The one thing that I would just say, and Jed also raised this about liberal arts. Liberal arts doesn't simply mean doing the arts and the writing and these sorts of skills. It also potentially means understanding enough of science and the way that science is going to be able to engage with scientists, understand, communicate what they're doing. Because to an earlier question, how can you make sense of misinformation, disinformation? Science is absolutely critical. It's often contested, which makes it difficult to get your brain around. But I love science, and I think we've got to spread that love of that field as well.
Okay, I'm going to ask Muhammad Khalid. Please unmute and ask your question. Hello, Muhammad Khalid. I don't know if he's still around.
Another one, though.
Come back.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not sure. He's not responding.
Yeah,
so
let's
anyway,
come back.
Natombi,
Yeah.
please unmute and ask your question, dear.
Good evening to everyone. Thank you so much for the informative discussion. I'd like to focus on the movement of technology and the innovation. I'm coming from South Africa, and so we have a huge gap between, our economic status of people who have a very high economic status and very low economic status. But that is not the only issue, is that we also have a huge gap between literate and illiterate people. And so with the way things are going, technology innovation seems to be, the civilization of everyone and westernization. My question is, how do we bridge the gap? Because just because people may be illiterate doesn't mean that there's no wisdom. And so often we see that there are people who are being left behind with regards to where the world is moving towards. So, for instance, in agriculture, people may not be literate, but they know the wisdom of, producing farms and planting and farming and all of those things. With AI, children may be very much used to technology and all those sorts of things, whereas maybe their grandparents who used to tell storytelling and pass wisdom in that way, that is still wisdom. So how do we bridge the gap towards where the world is going now, but still keeping, the people, the majority of the people who may be illiterate, but still have wisdom?
Natombia, maybe I can just start. I think that's an incredibly powerful question. And Jed has already referred to the wealth divides around the world. South Africa happens to be experiencing particular problems there. One simple answer to your question is social entrepreneurs in different parts of the world are trying to address those sorts of issues. And I'm sure you're already connected with people in Southern Africa operating in that sort of way. But there's some extraordinary individuals and centers that link them. But just before handing over to Jed, I just wanted to say something, which is that I think a lot of the technology now, and a lot of the sustainability movement has been focusing on creating more data and more information, and then to some degree, market intelligence or whatever built on that. What we've singularly failed often to do is to focus on wisdom, and which is why I think your question is so important. And Jed already referred to some of the spiritual sides of all of this. I think they're going to become more important over time. Jed.
Well, and I think that the part of the power of the emerging technologies is that they can be put into the hands of people who may not fully understand or appreciate the source of those technologies, but can explore and learn how to apply these tools to tell stories, to control the narrative, to be engaged. And, I think there's phenomenal possibilities around this as well. But the key point in making the shift that I think you're pointing us toward is this idea that we have to value different perspectives. We have to understand that there is a difference between information and data and wisdom and knowledge. And each of these are different parts of what we as a community have got to promote and advance and connect. If we're going to capture the full value, we all have the potential to collaborate around co-creating.
Yeah.
Okay. I got a message from Muhammad Khalid. He's in a very noisy place. There is one question left, and that's going to be the final we're going to take. It's from Kariman. Unbiased. She's one of our folks.
Hello, Kariman.
Thank you, Dr. Ali. Thank you, Dr. Ali. Thank you, John and Jed, for a great discussion. I just want to ask a quick question. With states like the US stepping back from the ESG support, can markets sustain sustainability alone? Has the state been the key driver all along? And if it's pulling out, what does a post-state ESG landscape look like? And which sectors do you think are best positioned to absorb impact capital without the public backing? Thank you so much.
So maybe I could just kick off. And, the United States, to your question, Kariman, states have been enormously important, and the intergovernmental agencies, we've mentioned the United Nations, but there are others out there, have also been immensely important. Things like the UN Sustainable Development Goals and so on as a framework for what happens in this area. But when you think about why states have become involved, you mentioned the United States. If you look at why that happened, Jed mentioned the Environmental Protection Agency. Why was there an EPA in the United States? It was because Dennis Hayes put together Earth Day in 1970. 20 million Americans came out into the streets and protested on environmental issues. Nixon, when he came into power, had no option but to regulate and set up the Environmental Protection Agency. So grassroots power has always been an influence, has always been a motive force where governments act. And I think that will continue to be the case. And a final point for me is just GlobeScan. Some of you will know GlobeScan. They're based in Toronto, in Canada. They've just done a report looking at the public opinion in the United States on critical issues, poverty, climate change, water pollution, access to water, and so on. And it's really interesting. The public opinion in the United States, which we're all focusing quite a lot on at the moment, has not changed that much at all. So underlying all of this, there's a public will for action to happen. The question is who's going to take it. And for a moment, we're going to have the US stepping back and in a way vandalizing the landscape. But to your question, others will step up. Quite who that's going to be and in what sort of configuration, I don't think any of us probably knows. Jed?
Well, and again, I think that they're at different points in time, the different aspects of our society step forward in different ways. And so in the United States, in the aftermath of the Great Depression, you had FDR, you had the creation of these governmental entities that really played a phenomenal role in kind of positioning us for what came then afterward. Those institutions, for better and worse, kind of like we're not the sole answer, if you will. And so in the 80s, 90s, and the aughts, you saw private market actors taking a whole different kind of role and posture in catalyzing social and environmental transformation and change. A lot of the work that I do is with private capital and asset owners who are investing directly in companies, in startups, in venture, in order to kind of seed these things that then can be taken by mainstream markets and government to scale. And so I think it's a consideration of context and what's present, what's working, what's not working, and how do those things that are not being effective provide opportunities for us to innovate and change and do things. And I think that this is a real opportunity, I think, for folks in other parts of the world outside of the US and Europe to really take control, take the lead as these other areas begin to step back a little bit for a whole host of reasons, right? And I think that's the opportunity set that many of you on this call will be kind of playing to over the next, decades as you go out and actually engage and connect and catalyze change in a variety of ways, both in terms of public sector and private innovation.
Yeah.
I think we should be wrapping up. So to conclude, I would want to give each one of you gentlemen a minute just to sort of say your cap statement. What do you think? What is your take
John,
about
would
this?
you like to go?
Please.
So you want me to go first, Jed?
Well, actually, I'll go first, and then you can do your Godfather kind of summation.
Ambassador of the future.
So we've talked a lot about what should we do and, how do we show up? How do we act in this time and space? And I guess the one thing I would do is say that we have to pause. We have to think and reflect. Again, there's a saying, don't just do something, sit there. And I think that instead of leading with what we think are the answers, we need to just stop and just think about what are the forces that we're a part of. And I think I spent a lot of my life feeling like I had to fight against all of these different things that were going on in the world. And I think over time, I realized that instead of being the rock in the river against the flow, I should have spent more time kind of just sitting in the flow and being a part of that redirection of energy and force and power. And again, maybe it's age and fatigue, but I also think that it is its own sense of wisdom, maybe, that all the questions that we're grappling with, and this is a much longer conversation maybe for a future webinar, but nothing that we're talking about today has not been addressed or explored or reflected upon by previous generations and traditions and wisdom literature. And I think we can't fall victim to this idea that somehow we're so smart and intelligent that we're the ones who have the answer. I think we need to, in some ways, go deeper in order to go further. And we need to position ourselves in traditions, in our wisdom literature, in our theology and spiritual practices, and in the understanding of inquiry and growth that we're really all a part of, that humanity has always been forcing forward. And that's really what we have the potential to tap into. Okay, John, top that.
I'm not going to top it. I'm going to say, hopefully everyone in this webinar can see why I love Jed. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I've really enjoyed the comments and the questions that people have raised. I wish it could go on, but I just want to celebrate the fact that we now have this technology where we can communicate across countries, across continents. And I think that's an incredible gift. So thank you, all those who've been developing these Zooms and other platforms. Let's use these platforms to have more of these conversations. And then over time, having sat and having reflected and having the conversations, then put together an action plan that blows these other folk out of the water in a friendly way and holding their hands as they go. But got to be done.
Okay. Thank you, guys. It's been very informative. We started with almost 100 attending, which is, I think it's with the current webinar fatigue that we're all experiencing, this is a huge number.
Well done.
It only dropped to 45 after half an hour.
I was going to say, we drove a lot of them away, though, Ali.
Yes.
No. It's the time. Most of people would actually have something to do at around 8 or 8 plus.
Okay. Yeah.
So I think it's just exceeding the time. But anyway, we still were able to hold 45. So I really want to thank you for beautiful, very open-minded discussions. And I want to thank the audience, especially the 44 that stayed with us until the end. Please keep following out our notices. We are in the process of arranging another 1 or 2 webinars before the end of the semester. Well, I think some of them will be around social capital and community-driven associations. How do you get consensus and communities and stuff like that, which is, I think, is pretty much what is very much needed nowadays. Again, I thank you, and it's a pleasure to have you all. Thank you, guys.
Thank you all.
Thank you all very much.
Bye.